I have no idea how to start this video. Hey, how's it going? Welcome to Echoed Word Reviews. Hope you're having a great day, or if you are probably listening to this while falling asleep, I hope that this video lulls you into a restful slumber, which I think is fitting for this book, which is one about the painful boredom of life, and a book in which a lot of people have criticized for being boring. And we'll talk about that criticism in the scope of this video, actually. Today we're going to be talking about Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, specifically the Adam Thorpe translation, because, I mean, look at that cover. The cover is amazing. And just a note or forewarning, but this review, discussion, analysis thing will contain spoilers. So if you're planning on reading Madame Bovary and don't want it to be spoiled, I suggest you watch other videos. But if you're still here, I think we've killed enough time, and the cogs in my brain have gotten us to a place where we can start talking about this book, because it is really hard to figure out where to start when you are dealing with something as monumental as Madame Bovary, something that is studied to this extent and such a just famous work of literature. It's always hard to figure out where to begin. So enough dilly-dallying, and let's just get into it. Why had she not seized that happiness while it offered itself? Why had she not held it back with both hands on both knees when it wished to flee? And she cursed herself for not having loved Léon. She thirsted for his lips. She longed to run and join him, to throw herself in his arms, to say to him, "I am here, I am yours." But Emma fretted beforehand over the difficulties of the undertaking, and her desires, augmented by regret, became still more potent. Thenceforth, the memory of Léon lay at the center of her ennui. It crackled there, more fiercely than a traveler's fire on a Russian steppe, abandoned in the snow. She hastened toward him. She huddled up against him. She delicately stirred this hearth that had all but died away. She went searching all around her for what might revive it further, and the remotest reminiscences, as well as the most recent encounters, her actual experiences along with her imaginings, her scattered cravings for voluptuousness, her plans for happiness that creaked in the wind like dead boughs, her barren virtue, her tumbled hopes, the straw litter of domesticity, she gathered all, seized all, and let it all serve to rekindle her sadness. Nevertheless, the flame subsided, either because the fuel itself was spent, or its pile too considerable. Bit by bit, love died away through absence. Regret was stifled by habit, and that fiery glimmer that empurpled her pale sky was further clouded by shadow and gradually blotted out. In the slumbering state of her conscience, she even took husband-hatred for lover-longing, the scorch of spite for the rekindling of tender love. But, as the storm was still blowing, and her passion burned to ashes, and since no help came, no sun appeared, utter night fell on every side, and she remained lost in a terrible cold that penetrated her through and through. Madame Bovary is a monumentally influential French novel, originally published in 1857 by French author Gustave Flaubert. It was his first novel, although not his first literary endeavor. Before Madame Bovary, he spent a couple years writing another novel that it appears couldn't have been more different from what Madame Bovary ended up being. And he had a 600-page manuscript that he read to some friends, and they told him to burn it. And so after that, he started working on Madame Bovary. It took him 5 years to write, and more crucially than that, to edit. As the fantastic introduction to this edition states, he would spend days working on sentences. There would be a week, like weeks span of time where he'd only be able to get through a couple pages, because he was so hyper-fixated in the editing process. Flaubert famously said that he doesn't think that there's such a thing as synonyms. And so every single word he would hang on and find the perfect word, the perfect sentence structure, the perfect way of articulating things for its maximum emotional and descriptive effect. And you can tell this even in a translation. The writing is so impactful and intentional, from the description of food to the description of textiles to the tactile description of what it is like to cross a stream and have the feeling of grass as it wets your skirt. I mean, it's very very, very descriptive. And this description is all why Madame Bovary is held up as one of the shining examples, if not the shining example, of literary realism. So much of this book is Flaubert taking an almost microscopic approach to every single aspect of provincial life in France. And that level of description isn't just limited to the tactile and the physical and the tangible. It's also used devastatingly effectively as a way to critique the actual characters in this book. Everything from their sort of hypocrisies to their idiosyncrasies are all highlighted with that same level of detail. And it's for that reason that Madame Bovary is as important as it is. Because really, the story is very, very simple. Spoiler warnings, it tells the story of a young, imaginative woman, Emma Bovary, who grew up in the French countryside, with a head full of dreams that are shaped by the art and literature and stories of the time. What she desires more so than anything are those big, grandiose moments and feelings and experiences that she has read about in her, sort of romance stories. And so believing in and expecting, true love and all of its grandness, she very quickly gets married to a country doctor, Charles, but very quickly realizes that she was sold a false bill of goods when it comes to marriage and romance and life itself. She begins to loathe her husband and despise married life because her marriage and her husband embody everything that she detests. Mediocrity, complacency, passivity. These are all qualities that she absolutely despises. So she begins chasing emotional highs and looking for this, injection of emotion wherever she can through a series of affairs, as well as overall living very extravagantly. However, being that this book is almost a statement and a teardown and a critique of romanticism, she of course does not find happiness through this new way of living her life, and instead she comes to find the bitter truth, and that's that, the passions of adultery, the excitement, wears off. And after a while, when something is routine, it becomes just as mundane as the thing that you're trying to get away from in the first place. And so after her affairs become just as dull as her married life, she continues to live extravagantly, racking up immense amounts of debt that ultimately lead to her downfall. And so when faced with this inescapable financial ruin and backed into a corner, she poisons herself. To the previous 400 pages, you've been treated to this decadent type of writing, this incredibly detailed descriptions paint such a vivid picture. And now you have that style, that same level of description, describe a woman dying in bed over the course of 2 days. Which is why, even though Madame Bovary is not a very plot-driven novel, its ending is really effective. I'm not going to say it's like a twist ending, but it definitely makes you stop and go, Jesus, I was not expecting that. The novel concludes with showing how the ramifications of the actions of her life continue to make waves even after her death, in that the financial ruin then passes to her husband, Charles, who, upon learning of the reality of her adulteries, ends up dying, and then her daughter goes and lives with distant relatives, growing up completely destitute. There are no happy endings in Madame Bovary, except for maybe the opportunistic apothecary pharmacist, Monsieur Homais, who, he gets pretty much everything that he wanted. So why is Madame Bovary so great? Well, as we talked about, it's its style. Before Flaubert had published this, we had never seen a book that talked with this level of description, this very poetical prose, this flowery diction, but apply it to the subject matter of the doldrums of existence and the minor behaviors of everyday people. It's like the literary equivalent of that handyman in the UK who took the old Ferrari and chopped it into a pickup truck and used it as a work truck. There's something just so almost punk rock about it, where Flaubert was writing in the style of the time, but turned his eye to something that nobody else was writing about, but did it in a way that goes beyond an affectation, and did it so earnestly and so truthfully that it spawned a new genre of literature. One of the things that I find funny is that some of Flaubert's friends didn't really like this book. It wasn't their cup of tea. And you can find out about this. In this edition, there's notes in the back that have call-outs and sort of point out, in addition to some of the historical references in the book, we'll also call out the more autobiographical elements of the book, because Flaubert took a lot of influence from his own life in here and wrote some of his friends as characters or made references to that. In one of my favorite moments is the locket that Emma gives to one of her affair partners is inscribed with the same inscription that one of Flaubert's affair partners gave to him. But because he was writing in such a new way, and he almost had a bone to pick with the sort of existing literary style, some of his friends who really liked that romantic style of writing and subject matter absolutely hated Madame Bovary, and also were kind of mad at Flaubert because they saw it as a personal attack, like his rejection of the style that they liked, that was the prevailing style of the time, was almost a criticism of who they were as people and a rejection of them. And I think it's kind of funny to see that behavior, 165 years ago, because we see it almost every day now, where anytime you criticize, a fandom or, a movie, whatever, like Marvel is a good example, you have these slathering hordes of defenders of this, of this franchise come after you because they take it as a personal attack on them. But over the course of the book, Emma realizes that all of the sort of expectations of life that she had gotten from, her stories and art are bullshit, and becomes very disillusioned with that even. And there's a great passage when this comes to roost, when Emma goes to an opera and sees, this love story play out in front of her eyes. Emma dreamed of her marriage day, and she saw herself back there in the midst of the cornfields on the little path when they were walking to the church. Why then had she not similarly resisted, entreated, like this woman, the woman in the story? On the contrary, she was glad, not perceiving the abyss she was throwing herself into. Ah, if in the bloom of her beauty, before the strain of marriage and the disillusion of adultery, she had been able to lay her life upon some great stout heart, thus mingling virtue, love, voluptuousness, and duty, never would she have fallen from so supreme a bliss. But that happiness was doubtless a lie contrived as the despair of all desire. She knew now the pettiness of passions that art exaggerated. Forcing herself, therefore, to avert her thoughts, Emma no longer wished to see in this reproduction of her sorrows anything but an artificial fancy fit for keeping the eye entertained, and she was even smiling inwardly out of scornful pity, when at the back of the stage, beneath the velvet curtains, a man appeared in a black cloak. So she has this moment of clarity, and then immediately gets cast into another daydream once this handsome, singer takes to the stage. And I think there's a great sort of criticism there where Flaubert is highlighting sort of the shallowness of this character, and maybe the shallowness of the people who partook and enjoyed this, what I can only assume from this book, what he saw as this, pulpy form of art that said nothing worthwhile. So on the note of saying nothing, Madame Bovary is a book in which a lot of people, especially nowadays, the modern audience criticizes for being a book in which nothing happens. Which is kind of true to an extent, but despite the fact that nothing really big happens, like it's not a plot-heavy book, it is not saying nothing. It is one of the most honest portrayals of the human condition in all of literature. I remember watching a video essay a few years ago, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, from another YouTuber. I want to say it's the Nerd Writer. But it was a video essay about Seinfeld, which is one of my favorite shows. And in the essay, the guy highlighted a Flaubert quote that was in a correspondence with a friend of his. And I think it was after Madame Bovary, and he was talking about sort of his, future ambitions. And he said something along the lines of, his dream is to write a book about nothing, in which nothing happens. Like, the story is not propelled by an external force, but is held together by the internal strength of its style. And that's a quote that has stuck with me for all of these years. A book about nothing held together by the internal strength of its style. Now, the way that this quote was used is, obviously, Seinfeld is quite often called the show about nothing.
The show is about nothing. Well, it's not about nothing. No, it's about nothing.
But the point of the essay being that within nothingness is everything. Our lives are, for the most part, hopelessly dull. Voids in which nothing really happens. And to that end, I see the boredom in Madame Bovary, the boredom that it describes, and quite possibly the boredom that it elicits in the reader, is the point. And that dovetails into another one of the modern criticisms that I've seen of Madame Bovary, and that's people saying that it's this anti-feminist novel in which Emma gets punished for stepping out of the provincial morals of the time. And I could not see it more differently. Flaubert has gone on record and said that Madame Bovary, c'est moi. Madame Bovary is me. And then he further said that if you are a creative person, if you're an idealist, you are Madame Bovary. And I think that in describing this sheer, overwhelming boredom of this type of life is in a way him understanding why Madame Bovary is the way that she is and empathizing with it and saying that, yeah, if you are a creative person, if you are a dreamer, of course you want to break out because life is so fucking dull. Life is just so boring and awful and terrible. And why would you want to be like Charles Bovary? Why would you want to be like Monsieur Homais? Why would you want to be like any of the people in this town? Because it is just not a worthwhile way of living. And there is a historical social criticism wrapped up into that, which is that at this time the French government was trying to bestow, simple provincial life with some type of, government-sanctioned dignity and trying to almost romanticize the toilers of the earth as being these noble and worthwhile people. There's a famous scene in the book in which a government official comes down and starts handing out awards for this, that, and the other thing. And people thought, I guess at the time, that it was a reference to an actual speech that happened in a village because it was written so fucking close to what this official in the real world said. But Flaubert wrote it before that had even happened, and it's full of just these mealy-mouthed, pithy sayings of nothingness. And I think that Flaubert had a bone to pick with that. And that these attempts to elevate what is really an impoverished and unglamorous way of living was a self-serving and cynical approach from the government. So because it works on, so many levels and there's so much going on within it, Madame Bovary is a very well-studied book. It is in standard curriculum in high schools and, early sort of lower-level English classes in college. I didn't read it in high school, and I haven't taken any, classes in college, so I didn't get exposed to it that way. However, that is most people's exposure to it, which I think does the book a disservice. I think a lot of those books that become standard curriculum get very misunderstood, and it's hard to find good takes about Madame Bovary. There is a famous essay, a published essay called Perpetual Orgy by Mario Vargas Llosa that is supposedly a really great critical look at Madame Bovary. But we're not going to talk about that. Instead, we're going to take a jaunt through the bastion of well-reasoned and well-thought-out takes that you can only find on Goodreads.com. Too many wordy descriptions of what people were wearing, what the buildings looked like, etc. If you're going to take a long time to tell a story, it had better be a good story. This one is not 1 star. Hard to argue with that. Why are all the, quote, great classics, led by famed female heroines, all too often about personal freedom through means of sexual compromise, leading to abject misery and ultimate demise? I realize it's an accurate depiction of culture and times, which is the fucking point of having a book about realism, but I digress. However, why are Bovary and Moll Flanders the memorable matriarchs of classic literature? Why aren't there more works about strong women making a difference in their own lives, if not those of their families and communities? Why aren't we having young women read a work or two portraying a strong female who doesn't end up having an affair, committing suicide, or otherwise screwing up her own life and the lives of others as she sinks to the bottom where she inevitably belonged? Where are the strong sentient heroines who might make feminists look slightly intelligent and or inspirational? I don't know, maybe go read the Hunger Games or something. I do love how the person puts the point of the book in their criticism here. And also we've talked about why I wholeheartedly disagree with the critique that Madame Bovary is an anti-feminist book that vilifies Emma Bovary. I think that the book goes out of its way to empathize with her. I don't think I have ever hated a character as much as I hated Madame Bovary, and I pretty much hated Voldemort with every cell in my body. I understand that Flaubert was going for realism, but Emma was beyond realism. She seemed a caricature of all that I would hate in a woman. A bored simpleton who thinks obsessively only about herself and makes the stupidest decisions. Yeah, it's almost like Flaubert was making a critique about, the milieu of romantic literature and how it was an intellectual contagion that could fill people with unfulfillable dreams that ultimately leads to them being dissatisfied with the life that they live. This novel was like arsenic poisoning with page numbers. Even taken in context, it fails to satisfy in either an aesthetic or intellectual capacity. As I recall from class, we did a review of some color-coded symbols. I guess that was supposed to make it significant. This is why I think that a lot of the way that we teach classics is absolutely fucking broken. A lot of it goes into symbolism and, trying to divine meaning in that way. It's a much richer way of reading Madame Bovary to read it aesthetically, which I guess, this guy, Rob, doesn't think that it works on an aesthetic level. But I think that there's so much more fruitful ways to read Madame Bovary than trying to read it symbolically. This must be what erectile dysfunction feels like. I'm finished. I can't go any further, but I am ashamed that the book has not yet reached its climax and Emma Bovary is left unsatisfied. Sorry, Emma. This book is boring. There is nothing particularly offensive about it, except for its boringness. I found myself on public transport, staring off into space instead of reading. I would rather the situational boredom of a 1-hour train ride than inducing boredom on myself by reading. Wow, it's almost like Flaubert has, with this book, put you in the headspace of Emma Bovary and sort of forced you to empathize and feel what she feels, which is this suffocating, inescapable hell that every single second of human existence is for her. So a lot of those reviews are funny and it's easy to laugh at them. It's constantly entertaining to read through 1-star reviews on Goodreads. But it also is hard to argue with some of them. Honestly, Madame Bovary is a boring book. It's boring, it's dull. It took me a long time to read it, and I'm a very fast reader, and it still took me like a month to get through it. There were just days when I just did not want to open the book. But that doesn't mean that it's a bad book. The boredom is the point. And I know that if you read books for plot and story and you want to be entertained, that sort of seems like a cop-out, but it isn't. This book makes you feel. Granted, it's not a feeling like, being swept up in a whirlwind of romance. It doesn't make your, heart pound with, action sequences. It doesn't make you hold your breath through suspense. However, it makes you feel every second. It makes you feel that suffocation that Emma is feeling. And that is a monumental, historical achievement in literature. So that is Madame Bovary. Who should read it? Well, if you like literature, if you want to explore the Western canon, you definitely have to read it. I mean, it's so influential. It is so important that you got to get around to it eventually. And that's kind of it. If you want something entertaining, if you want a story, if no, go read other books. There's other, great books. You could read Hemingway. You could read, there's still great books that have more excitement and more story and plot. If that's what you're looking for, this is a book that you should stay away from. But with that said, it is now time to ascertain what Madame Bovary's stickiness rating is. I found myself having to intentionally not just put a sticky note on every single page because, like I said at the start, this book is written so sumptuously, so descriptively that there is, on every page, every sentence is perfect, amazing, decadent writing. And so instead I tried to find passages that I think, really put a hat on top of a hat when it came to, speaking thematically. Otherwise, every single page would be marked here. So this edition of the book is 417 pages long, and there were 42 stickies that I marked in here, which gives us a stickiness rating of 9.9. Again, the stickiness rating is a completely subjective bullshit metric that just shows, what stuck out to me when I was reading. It is no judge of the quality or lack thereof of a book. But with all of that said, thank you so much for watching and sticking with this review of Madame Bovary. Just going off of how long it's been recording, I think that this is going to be one of the longer videos, if not the longest, at least until we get to Blood Meridian, which... I mean, I don't even know where to start with that one. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, drop a comment. I'd love to know your thoughts on Madame Bovary, and if you didn't like this video, feel free to leave a dislike, but also leave a comment letting me know what I can do better in the future. So, with that, thanks, and yeah, we'll see you on the next one.